Have you ever stopped to think about what happens when a child is forced to witness the unspeakable? When instead of learning letters and numbers in a schoolroom, he learns them in a place where human beings stand on wooden platforms, stripped of dignity, sold like livestock? What if that child, surrounded by horror, discovered within himself an extraordinary gift? A memory so precise, so relentless, that it would one day become the most dangerous weapon against those who believed they owned him? There exists a place where the Ohio River meets the Mississippi, where two great waters collide and churn beneath limestone bluffs, where fog rises thick on autumn mornings and secrets have a way of disappearing into the current. Cairo, Illinois. A town that in 1848 stood as a gateway between freedom and bondage, between the states that had abolished slavery and those that clung to it with bloody fingers. And in the heart of that town, there was an alley where human lives had prices chalked on slate boards, where mothers were separated from children by the swing of a gavel, where futures ended and nightmares began. But this story is not about that alley. Not really. This story is about a boy named Elijah. A boy who, by the age of 12, had memorized every price, every sale, every name, every buyer, every seller, every transaction that passed through that narrow corridor of human suffering. A boy who carried in his mind a ledger more complete than any written record. A boy who would use that gift to bring down an empire built on flesh and blood. If you want to discover how a child's memory became the instrument of liberation for hundreds, how numbers meant for commerce became codes for freedom, how the very system designed to enslave created the tools of its own destruction, stay with me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what I am about to reveal has been buried for over a century, hidden in forgotten archives and whispered in family stories passed down through generations. This is the story they never wanted you to know. This is the story of Elijah, and nothing will ever be the same after you hear it. The ruins still stand if you know where to look. Not the grand ruins of ancient civilizations, not crumbling temples or fallen columns, but something far more haunting. A foundation of weathered brick, half swallowed by kudzu and rivergrass, sits at the corner of what was once Commerce Street and Levee Road in Cairo, Illinois. The locals do not speak of it. The historical markers make no mention of it. But the ground remembers. The earth itself seems to hold its breath in that place, as if the screams absorbed into the soil over decades have never quite faded, as if the tears that soaked into the wooden floorboards left a residue that time cannot wash away. In the spring of 1848, this was the busiest corner in Cairo. Merchants in tailored coats walked these streets with ledgers under their arms. Riverboat captains negotiated cargo rates in the taverns that lined the waterfront. Cotton brokers, tobacco traders, livestock dealers all conducted their business in the shadow of the three-story building that dominated this intersection. Hargrove and Associates, the sign read, painted in gilt letters that caught the morning sun. Purveyors of quality labor. The euphemism was intentional. The reality was monstrous. If you are watching this and you care about the stories that have been erased from our collective memory, if you believe that truth matters even when it is painful, then subscribe to this channel right now. What happened in that building? What happened in the alley behind it? What one boy witnessed and remembered and ultimately used to tear the whole rotten structure down? This is history that demands to be known. Thaddeus Hargrove built his empire on a simple observation: geography is destiny. Cairo sat at the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, the exact point where the free states of the north met the slave states of the south. Fugitives fleeing northward had to cross these waters. Slave catchers pursuing them had to navigate these currents, and traders moving human cargo between markets in New Orleans, Memphis, St. Louis, and Louisville all passed through this nexus. Hargrove saw opportunity where others saw only muddy banks and fever-ridden bottomlands. He saw a toll booth on the highway of human misery. He saw profit. The building he constructed in 1831 was designed with specific purposes in mind. The ground floor served as a legitimate trading post, dealing in furs, grain, and manufactured goods from the east. The second floor housed Hargrove's offices, where he entertained business partners and negotiated contracts. The third floor, with its windows painted black and its single reinforced door, was the holding facility. And behind the building, accessible only through a narrow passageway between brick walls, lay the alley, the auction alley, the place where human beings were displayed, examined, bid upon, and sold. The alley measured 47 feet long and 12 feet wide. Elijah knew these dimensions exactly because he had paced them countless times, his bare feet memorizing every crack in the flagstones, every drainage channel, every iron ring bolted to the walls where the chains attached. The eastern wall rose 3 stories, windowless, featureless except for the water stains that streaked down from the roofline like tears frozen in brick. The western wall was lower, topped with broken glass set in mortar to prevent escape. At the north end stood a wooden platform, 18 inches high, 8 feet wide, with a single step leading up. This was where they stood. This was where they were sold. The smell never left that alley. Decades of human fear had soaked into every porous surface. Sweat and blood and worse had seeped between the flagstones. The summer heat would cause the stench to rise in waves, and even the buyers in their perfumed handkerchiefs would wrinkle their noses as they examined the merchandise. In winter, the cold would trap the smell close to the ground, and the slaves waiting their turn on the platform would stand in a miasma of accumulated terror, breathing in the despair of all who had come before them. Elijah first saw the alley when he was 7 years old. He was not brought there to be sold, not that day. He was brought there to work. His mother, a woman named Patience, had been purchased by Hargrove 3 years earlier, valued for her skills as a seamstress and her ability to read and write, abilities she had carefully hidden from her previous owner, but which Hargrove had somehow discovered and decided to exploit. Patience mended the clothing of the slaves being prepared for sale, making them presentable, hiding the worst of the scars. Stitching closed the wounds that might lower their price. She also kept records, not official records. Those were maintained by Hargrove's white clerks, but shadow records, hidden records, a parallel accounting that would one day prove more valuable than anyone could have imagined. The boy Elijah was put to work fetching water, emptying chamber pots, running messages between the building and the riverfront. He was small for his age, quiet, with eyes that seemed too large for his face, and a stillness that made adults uncomfortable. He did not cry. He did not complain. He watched. And he remembered. The first sale he witnessed in full was on a Tuesday in September of 1841. He was 7 years and 4 months old. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with the promise of rain that would not fall. 14 souls stood in the alley that morning, arranged in order of estimated value. At the front, a skilled blacksmith named Solomon, his arms thick with muscle, his back a topography of old whip scars that the buyers examined with clinical detachment. At the back, a woman holding twin infants, their cries the only sound in the awful silence before the bidding began. Hargrove himself conducted the auction that day. He was a tall man, thin in a way that suggested consumption rather than discipline, with pale eyes that seemed to absorb light without reflecting it. His voice carried the cadences of Virginia aristocracy, though Elijah would later learn he had been born in a Baltimore slum and had invented his ancestry along with his fortune. He spoke of the merchandise as a farmer might speak of livestock, pointing out strong limbs and healthy teeth, noting breeding potential and work capacity, assuring buyers of docility and training. Solomon sold for $1,200 to a cotton planter from Mississippi. The woman with the twins sold for $600, alone. The twins were sold separately, $150 each, to different buyers. The woman's screams as her children were carried away echoed off the brick walls for what seemed like hours. Elijah stood in the corner, a bucket of water in his hands, and watched, and remembered. Solomon, $1,200. Tobias Mercer of Natchez, Mississippi. Rebecca, $600. James Whitfield of Memphis. Twin boys, names unknown, $150 each. First to Whitfield, second to a man in a gray coat whose name was spoken too quietly for Elijah to hear. That night, lying on the pallet he shared with his mother in the cellar of Hargrove's building, Elijah recited everything he had seen. Not just the names and the prices, but the details. The way Solomon had clenched his jaw when the bidding reached 1,000. The precise shade of blue in Rebecca's head wrap. The number of buttons on Mercer's waistcoat, 7, brass, the third from the bottom slightly tarnished. The time the first bid was called, 3 minutes past 9 by the clock tower visible above the western wall. The time the last gavel fell, 11:47. Patience listened to her son's recitation with a mixture of wonder and horror. She had known the boy was gifted. She had taught him his letters at 4, his numbers at 5, and by 6 he could recite entire chapters of the Bible after hearing them once. But this was different. This was not memory for its own sake. This was something that could be used. She began to train him deliberately after that night. Not openly, never openly, but in the quiet hours before dawn, in the stolen moments when the household slept, she taught him systems, how to organize information by category, by date, by connection, how to build mental structures to store vast quantities of data, how to cross-reference, to find patterns, to remember not just facts, but relationships between facts. And most importantly, she taught him to hide his gift, to appear slow, dull, unremarkable, to let his eyes go vacant when white men looked at him, to stumble over simple questions when tested, to be invisible. For the next 5 years, Elijah watched and remembered. He witnessed over 400 sales in the alley behind Hargrove and Associates. He memorized more than 2,000 names, the names of the sold and the names of the buyers, the names of the agents and the names of the ship captains who transported human cargo up and down the rivers. He memorized prices, dates, physical descriptions, family connections. He tracked which slaves were sold together and which were separated. He noted which buyers had reputations for cruelty and which were known to be marginally less brutal. He created in his mind a vast, interconnected web of the slave trade as it operated through the Cairo nexus, a database more complete than any that existed in written form. And every night, he recited what he had learned to his mother, who transcribed the most crucial details into a series of hidden notebooks, using a cipher she had invented, written in ink made from walnut husks, that would not show under normal light but would darken when heated. Leave a comment right now saying, "Never give up on truth if you believe that the stories of the oppressed deserve to be remembered." Let me know you are here, that you are listening, that these hidden histories matter to you. The hierarchy within Hargrove's operation was as rigid as any plantation. At the top sat Thaddeus Hargrove himself, the architect of the enterprise, who rarely dirtied his hands with the day-to-day operations, but who made every significant decision and took the largest share of every profit. Beneath him were his 3 sons, William, the eldest at 32, who managed the legitimate trading business, Thomas, 28, who handled the transportation and logistics of moving slaves between markets, and Cornelius, 25, who ran the auction operations and who spent most of his time in the alley wielding the gavel that sealed the fates of thousands. Below the Hargrove sons were the white employees, clerks, guards, overseers, and agents. Marcus Whitby, the chief clerk, maintained the official records in leather-bound ledgers that were the legal documentation of every sale. Ezekiel Crane, the head overseer, enforced discipline in the holding cells with a methodical brutality that left no visible marks. Damaged goods sold for lower prices. The guards worked in rotating shifts, armed with clubs and pistols, stationed at the alley entrances during sales and at the building doors at all other times. And at the bottom, of course, were the enslaved workers who kept the operation functioning. Cooks who prepared meals, cleaners who scrubbed the cells between occupants, seamstresses like Patience who prepared the merchandise for display, runners like Elijah who carried messages and performed the countless small tasks that kept the machinery of human commerce grinding forward. They were trusted after a fashion, trusted to be too broken, too dependent, too carefully watched to cause trouble. They were wrong. Cornelius Hargrove was 25 years old and entirely convinced of his own importance. He had inherited none of his father's cunning and all of his cruelty, amplified by the entitlement of a man who had never been told no. He wore clothes imported from London, ate food prepared by a chef trained in New Orleans, and spoke of the family business as if he were engaged in noble work rather than trafficking in human souls. He had a particular interest in the young women who passed through the holding cells, an interest that everyone knew about and no one discussed. It was Cornelius who first noticed Patience, and through her, Elijah. The day was March 15th, 1846. Elijah was 12 years old. A shipment had arrived from a failed plantation in Kentucky, 37 souls who had been worked nearly to death and were now being liquidated to cover their former owner's gambling debts. Among them was a girl of perhaps 16, light-skinned, with features that Cornelius found appealing. He had her brought to his private office on the second floor. What happened there, Elijah did not witness, but he heard the screams. So did everyone in the building. They pretended not to. When the girl was returned to the holding cells 3 hours later, she could not walk. Patience was sent to tend to her, to make her presentable for the auction scheduled for the following week. Elijah accompanied his mother, carrying the basin of water and the bundle of clean rags. The girl's name was Dinah. She was not 16, but 14. She died 2 days later, and her body was disposed of in the river to avoid questions that might affect the value of the remaining merchandise. Patience wept that night in the cellar, the first time Elijah had ever seen his mother cry. She wept for Dinah. She wept for the hundreds of others whose suffering she had witnessed. She wept for her son, for the boy whose childhood had been stolen, whose mind was filled with horrors no child should ever know. And then she dried her tears and began to plan. She had been in contact with a network for years, passing information through a system of signals and coded messages that connected the enslaved communities from Cairo to Cincinnati, from St. Louis to Chicago. The Underground Railroad, they called it, though it had no tracks and no stations, only people, brave people, mostly black but some white, who risked their lives to guide fugitives to freedom. Patience had provided intelligence to this network, which routes were watched, which slave catchers were active in the area, which safe houses had been compromised. But she had never attempted to escape herself. She had a son to protect, and capture meant death. But after Dinah, something changed. Patience looked at her son, at the boy who remembered everything, who carried in his head the evidence that could expose the full scope of Hargrove's operation, and she made a decision. The information Elijah possessed was too valuable to remain hidden. If it could be brought to the right people, if it could be documented and published and spread, it could do more than save individual lives. It could strike at the heart of the slave trade itself. The plan took 18 months to develop. Patience made contact with Levi Coffin, the Quaker abolitionist who operated the most extensive network of safe houses in the region. She arranged for copies of her hidden notebooks to be smuggled out one at a time, carried by trusted operatives to a safe location in Cincinnati. She began to teach Elijah the routes, the signals, the contacts he would need if he ever had to flee alone. And she waited for the right moment. That moment came on October 3rd, 1848. Hargrove was hosting a gathering, a celebration of sorts, to mark the 20th anniversary of his business. Buyers and traders from across the region had been invited. Wine flowed in the upper floors while, in the cells below, over 60 slaves waited for the massive auction scheduled for the following morning. It would be the largest sale in the history of the Cairo operation, and Hargrove intended it to be a spectacle. But Patience had other plans. The network had positioned operatives throughout Cairo, waiting for her signal. A steamboat captain sympathetic to the cause had arranged to delay his departure from the dock. False documents had been prepared, routes had been scouted, and most importantly, a man had arrived from the east, a man named Frederick, who had escaped from slavery himself and had become one of the most effective agents of liberation in the country. Frederick had a plan, a dangerous plan, but one that could free not just Elijah and Patience, but everyone in Hargrove's holding cells. The signal was to be given at midnight. A lantern placed in the third-floor window, visible from the river where the steamboat waited. But at 11 o'clock, disaster struck. One of the guards making his rounds discovered Patience in the cellar, packing a small bag. He raised the alarm. Within minutes, she was dragged before Cornelius Hargrove, who had left his father's party to deal with this disruption. The hidden notebooks were found. The cipher was beyond Cornelius's understanding, but he knew treachery when he saw it. He beat her himself in the alley, in the place where so many had suffered before her. Elijah was forced to watch, held by 2 guards who laughed at his struggles. Cornelius used a cane, then a whip, then his fists when he grew tired of the implements. Patience did not beg. She did not name her contacts. She did not reveal the location of the other notebooks or the existence of the network that awaited her signal. She looked once at her son, and in that look was everything: love, apology, instruction, command. Remember. Tell them. Make it mean something. She died at 11:30. Cornelius, breathing hard from his exertions, ordered her body thrown in the river. Then he turned to Elijah. The boy stood motionless between the guards, his face blank, his eyes empty. 12 years old, small for his age, unremarkable in every visible way. Cornelius saw nothing threatening in him, only a piece of property temporarily associated with a troublesome mother. He ordered Elijah returned to the cellar and locked in. Tomorrow, after the auction, he would decide what to do with him. It was the last mistake Cornelius Hargrove would ever make. Elijah did not sleep that night. He sat in the darkness of the cellar, listening to the sounds of the celebration continuing above him, and he began to prepare. His mother had taught him well. The plan had been disrupted, but not destroyed. The signal had not been given, but the operatives were still in position. The notebooks had been discovered, but the most valuable information was not in those notebooks. It was in his head. At 3 a.m, when the celebration had finally quieted and the guards had grown drowsy, Elijah made his move. His mother had taught him the layout of the building, every door and window, every weak point in the security. She had hidden a key, months ago, in a crack in the cellar wall. Elijah retrieved it now, feeling the cold metal against his palm. The key opened the cellar door. The darkness was complete, but Elijah knew every inch of this building. He moved silently through the corridors, past the snoring guards, up the back stairs to the 3rd floor. The window that faced the river was there, just as his mother had described. The lantern was there, hidden in a cabinet. And at 3 in the morning of October 4th, 1848, Elijah lit the lantern and placed it in the window. The light was visible for less than a minute before he extinguished it. But it was enough. On the river, the steamboat's captain saw the signal and began the final preparations for departure. In the town, the operatives saw the signal and began to move. What followed was the largest slave liberation in the history of Illinois. If you have been watching this story and it has touched your heart, if you believe that the courage of Elijah and patience deserves to be remembered, then leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who truly cares about these hidden histories. The operatives worked with military precision. They had planned for this moment, rehearsed their movements, assigned their roles. Frederick led the assault on the building itself, a team of 6 men who neutralized the guards without killing them. The movement prided itself on avoiding bloodshed when possible, though they came armed and prepared to fight if necessary. Other teams secured the routes to the river, blocking access from the town center and preparing diversions to confuse any pursuit. Elijah guided them. He knew the building better than anyone alive. He led them to the holding cells on the 3rd floor, where 63 terrified souls waited in the darkness. He knew which locks required keys and which could be forced. He knew which floorboards creaked and which stairs were solid. He moved through the building like a ghost, and the operatives followed. The liberation took 47 minutes. 63 souls descended from that building, moving in groups of 8 or 10, guided through the empty streets to the riverfront where the steamboat waited. Among them were families that had expected to be separated the next morning. Among them were children who had been born in bondage and would grow up in freedom. Among them was an old man named Solomon, who had been sold in this very alley 7 years earlier, who had escaped from Mississippi and been recaptured, and was about to be sold again, who now walked to freedom with tears streaming down his face. Elijah was the last to board the steamboat. He stood for a moment on the dock, looking back at the building where his mother had died, where he had witnessed years of unspeakable suffering, where he had memorized every detail of a system designed to destroy him. Then he turned and walked up the gangplank, and the steamboat pulled away into the fog. The Hargrove family discovered the liberation at dawn. The holding cells stood empty. The guards lay bound and gagged in the alley. And on Thaddeus Hargrove's desk, placed there by someone during the night, was a single sheet of paper. On it was written a message. "We have taken back 63 of your stolen people. We know the names of every soul you have sold, every buyer who purchased them, every dollar that changed hands. We know your crimes, and we are coming for the rest." It was unsigned, but Cornelius knew. He remembered the boy with the blank eyes. He remembered the mother who had not broken even under the whip. And for the first time in his life, he felt fear. The pursuit began immediately. Hargrove's agents fanned out across the river, seeking any sign of the escaped slaves. Telegraphs were sent to every port and crossing for 300 miles. A reward was posted, $5,000 for the capture of the fugitives, $10,000 for the boy called Elijah. But the network was well prepared. The steamboat had carried its passengers only 20 miles upriver before transferring them to smaller craft that scattered in all directions. Some traveled overland through Indiana. Others continued by water to Chicago. Still others moved west toward territories where the law was less clear and freedom more possible. The trails split and split again, and the pursuers found themselves chasing shadows. Elijah himself traveled north, guided by a series of conductors who moved him from safe house to safe house. In each location, he recited what he remembered. Abolitionists transcribed his testimony, taking down names and dates and prices in careful handwriting. The scope of his knowledge astonished everyone who heard it. He could describe sales that had occurred when he was 8 years old with the same precision as those he had witnessed the week before. He could name buyers who had purchased slaves at Cairo and trace their subsequent sales across multiple states. He could identify forgeries in official documents, having memorized the authentic signatures of Hargrove's clerks. Within a month, his testimony had reached the offices of anti-slavery newspapers in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. Within 2 months, it was being read aloud in churches and meeting halls across the North. The detailed evidence of the Cairo operation, names, dates, amounts, atrocities, was impossible to dismiss as propaganda. Here was documented proof, provided by a witness with perfect recall, of the systematic horror that many in the North had preferred not to examine too closely. The effect was volcanic. Public sentiment, already shifting against slavery, hardened into outrage. Hargrove and Associates became a symbol of everything wrong with the peculiar institution. The name of Hargrove became synonymous with cruelty. Politicians who had counseled moderation found themselves denounced by constituents who had read Elijah's testimony. The Fugitive Slave Act, passed 2 years later, would be partly a response to the panic that Elijah's revelations caused among slaveholders, a desperate attempt to close the paths to freedom that the Cairo liberation had exposed. But the effect extended far beyond public opinion. Elijah's detailed records allowed the network to locate many of the people who had been sold through Cairo over the years. Liberation operations became more targeted, more effective, because the planners knew exactly who was being held where, who had purchased them, what the conditions of their bondage were. Over the following decade, an estimated 400 people were freed through operations that relied on intelligence originally provided by Elijah. And there was more: the names of the buyers, the amounts they had paid, the circumstances of their purchases. This information became a form of leverage. Some buyers, confronted with the possibility that their participation in the slave trade would become public, chose to free their slaves voluntarily rather than face exposure. Others found themselves blacklisted from business relationships with northern firms that had previously ignored the source of their southern partners' wealth. The economic foundations of the slave system were not destroyed by this pressure, but they were cracked in ways that would widen over the following years. Cornelius Hargrove did not live to see the final collapse of the system he had helped perpetuate. In the spring of 1849, 6 months after the liberation, he was found dead in the alley behind his father's building. His throat had been cut. The murder was never solved, though suspicions ran in many directions. Some believed it was the work of the network, vengeance for Patience and for Dinah and for all the others. Others thought it was a business rival, taking advantage of the chaos to eliminate a competitor. Still others whispered that it was one of Cornelius's own slaves, a house servant who had finally reached the limit of endurance. Thaddeus Hargrove buried his son and continued his business, but the operation never recovered its former scale. The publicity had made Cairo too visible, too watched. The network had demonstrated that no holding cell was impenetrable, no transaction safe from exposure. By 1852, Hargrove and Associates had ceased operations. Thaddeus Hargrove died in 1855, reportedly of liver failure brought on by years of heavy drinking. His remaining sons scattered, changing their names, trying to escape the notoriety that had attached to the family. Some of their descendants still live in the region today, though they do not speak of their ancestors. The building itself burned in 1858, under circumstances that were never investigated. By the time the fire brigades arrived, the structure was beyond saving. The walls collapsed inward, bringing down the floors where the holding cells had been, covering the alley where so many had been sold with rubble and ash. Some said it was an accident. Others said it was a ritual, a cleansing, a destruction of evidence. The truth, like so many truths from that era, has been lost. But Elijah remembered. He lived until 1903, dying at the age of 69 in a small house in Oberlin, Ohio. He had become a scholar, a teacher, a historian of his own experience. He wrote 2 books about the slave trade through Cairo, filling in details that his childhood testimony had only sketched. He testified before congressional committees. He spoke at meetings and conventions, and he trained others in the techniques of memory that his mother had taught him, passing on the skills that had made him so dangerous to the system that had tried to claim him. In his final years, he returned once to Cairo. The town had changed almost beyond recognition. The building was gone, replaced by a warehouse. The alley had been paved over, turned into a loading dock for riverfront commerce. The limestone bluffs still rose above the confluence, and the fog still came on autumn mornings, but the specific geography of horror had been erased, deliberately forgotten, covered with the amnesia that progress offers the guilty. Elijah walked through the space where the alley had been. He was an old man by then, white-haired, stooped, his eyes clouded with cataracts that made the world a blur of light and shadow. But he did not need to see. He remembered. He paced out the dimensions, 47 feet by 12 feet, and stood where the platform had been, where the gavel had fallen, where his mother had died. He stood there for a long time, silent, communing with ghosts that only he could perceive. A local newspaper reporter, hearing that a former slave with some connection to the area was visiting, came to interview him. The resulting article was published 2 days later under the headline, "Former Cairo Resident Recalls Old Times." It made no mention of slavery. It made no mention of the alley. It described Elijah as a colored gentleman of some education who had fond memories of the river and who spoke highly of the progress Cairo has made. The reporter had heard what he wanted to hear, seen what he wanted to see. Elijah's truth was too inconvenient, too disturbing, too real for the comfortable narrative of progress that the town preferred. But the truth persisted, in family stories passed from generation to generation. In the 2 books Elijah wrote, which remained in print for decades and were rediscovered by historians in the 20th century. In the records that patients had hidden and that had survived, smuggled out of Cairo in the chaos of the liberation, now preserved in archives at Oberlin and Howard and the Library of Congress. In the names of the 400 people freed through operations that Elijah's intelligence had enabled, names that appear in census records and church registers and family Bibles, names attached to people who lived and loved and raised children who raised the people who are alive today. The ground remembers, even when the monuments lie. The river keeps its secrets, but not forever. And somewhere in the soil beneath a loading dock in Cairo, Illinois, beneath the concrete and the gravel and the industrial debris of a century and a half of forgetting, the flagstones of the alley remain. Worn smooth by the feet of the sold, stained with the tears of the separated. Witnesses, in their silent way, to the truth that Elijah carried and that we carry now. Like this video, if the story of Elijah has touched your heart, share it so that the memory of patients and all who suffered in that alley will never be forgotten. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that the hidden stories of resistance and liberation deserve to be told. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here, so that I can know you, so that I can understand who truly cares about the truth that has been buried for too long." The alley is gone. The building is gone. The men who grew rich on human suffering are gone. But the memory remains. Elijah made sure of that. His mother made sure of that. And now, by knowing this story, by carrying it forward, you make sure of that too. This is the story of Cairo, 1848. This is the story of the alley where human lives had prices. And this is the story of the boy who memorized them all. The Ohio River runs 981 miles from Pittsburgh to Cairo, gathering tributaries as it flows, growing wider and deeper and more powerful with every mile. The Mississippi runs 2,320 miles from Lake Itasca to the Gulf of Mexico, draining 40% of the continental United States, carrying the runoff of 31 states to the sea. Where these two giants meet, the waters do not merge peacefully. They collide, swirl, create eddies and undertows that have swallowed boats and bodies since before recorded history. The indigenous peoples who lived here called this place the meeting of the waters. The French called it the confluence. The Americans who came later called it Cairo, after the Egyptian city at the junction of the Nile, though the resemblance was purely aspirational. In 1848, Cairo was less a town than a collection of ambitions. The permanent population numbered perhaps 600, swelling to several thousand when the river trade was active. The streets were mud when it rained, and dust when it did not. Yellow fever swept through regularly, carrying off dozens each summer. Malaria was endemic, bred in the standing water that collected in every low spot. The sensible, the healthy, the wealthy. None of them lived in Cairo if they had any choice. Cairo was for those who had no choice, and for those whose business required proximity to the rivers that were the arteries of continental commerce. The slave trade was that business, and Hargrove was its master. Understanding what Hargrove built requires understanding the geography of bondage. The southern states that produced cotton and sugar and tobacco required labor. Massive amounts of labor, more than their existing enslaved populations could provide, more than the natural increase of that population could supply. The northern states and the upper south had a surplus. Slaves whose labor was less economically valuable in those regions. Slaves inherited by owners who had no immediate use for them. Slaves whose sale could provide capital for other ventures. And connecting these two markets was the internal slave trade, the forced migration of an estimated 1 million people between 1820 and 1860, the greatest forced migration in North American history. Cairo sat at the crossroads of this traffic. Slaves from Kentucky and Virginia traveled down the Ohio. Slaves from Missouri traveled down the Mississippi. At Cairo, they were consolidated, evaluated, prepared for sale, and shipped onward to the cotton fields of the Deep South. It was, in purely logistical terms, a brilliant operation. Hargrove had created a hub, a transfer point, a place where economies of scale could be achieved in the business of human trafficking. The holding cells on the third floor could accommodate up to 100 people at a time, though this required packing them in conditions that even Hargrove acknowledged were detrimental to their health and therefore their value. More typically, he maintained a population of 40 to 60, arriving in groups of 10 or 20, departing in similar batches as buyers from downriver placed their orders. The turnover was constant. Elijah estimated that during his years in the building, he witnessed the processing of more than 3,000 individuals, men, women, and children, who passed through those cells on their way to fates he could only imagine. The routine was methodical. New arrivals were stripped, examined, recorded in Whitby's ledgers with notations about their physical condition, skills, and estimated value. They were fed a diet designed to improve their appearance, extra rations of meat and bread, molasses for sweetness, sometimes whiskey to improve their color and demeanor. Their wounds were treated, their clothing replaced, their hair and skin oiled to give the appearance of health and vitality. The goal was to maximize price, not to reduce suffering, but the effect was sometimes the same. The examinations were the worst part, or so Elijah's mother told him. She had witnessed them, had helped prepare women for them, had cleaned up afterward. Buyers wanted to know everything about the merchandise they were purchasing. They examined teeth and eyes, measured height and weight, tested strength and reflexes. They examined women's bodies for signs of childbearing capacity. They demanded demonstrations of skills, required literate slaves to read passages and numerate slaves to perform calculations. They looked for scars that might indicate rebellion or discipline problems, for brands that might indicate previous sales, for any detail that might affect value. And through it all, Elijah watched. He was too young to participate in the examinations, too small to be considered useful for the physical work of moving and confining the slaves. He was assigned to peripheral tasks, carrying water, emptying waste, running messages. But his peripheral position gave him access to everything. He saw what others ignored because he was himself invisible, a piece of furniture, a tool that required no attention. And he remembered. The records he created in his mind were more comprehensive than anything in Whitby's ledgers. Whitby recorded name, approximate age, physical description, skills, and sale price. Elijah recorded all of that, plus the details that Whitby considered irrelevant. The relationships between slaves who arrived together, the names they called each other in whispered conversations, the tears they shed when they thought no one was watching, the songs they sang in the holding cells after lights out. He recorded the buyers' conversations with each other, their offhand comments about conditions on their plantations, their plans for the slaves they were purchasing. He recorded the arguments between Hargrove's sons, the tensions between the white employees, the small corruptions and large brutalities that defined daily life in the operation, and he began to understand patterns, which buyers returned regularly and which were one-time purchasers, which sellers used Hargrove's operation exclusively and which also sold through competitors, which routes were favored for transport and at what seasons, which prices were standard and which represented premiums or discounts. By the time he was 10 years old, Elijah understood the economics of the Cairo slave trade better than most of the people who conducted it. He could predict, based on season and supply and the composition of a arriving group, approximately what each individual would sell for. He was almost never wrong. This knowledge, his mother realized, was dangerous. If the Hargroves ever understood what Elijah knew, what he had memorized, what he could testify to, they would kill him without hesitation. The evidence he carried could destroy not just their reputation, but their legal position. Many of their transactions skirted the edges of legality, even by the standards of the time. Some of them crossed those edges entirely. There were slaves who had been kidnapped from free states, their papers forged. There were slaves who had been promised freedom by dying owners, only to be sold by heirs who ignored or destroyed the manumission documents. There were slaves who should have been freed by the laws of states through which they had traveled, but who had been quietly returned to bondage and sold through Cairo to prevent any legal complications. Elijah knew all of this. He could name specific cases, cite specific dates, identify specific individuals whose freedom had been stolen through specific frauds. In the courts of the North, this testimony could lead to criminal prosecutions. In the court of public opinion, it could devastate the carefully maintained fiction that the slave trade was a legitimate business conducted by honorable men. So Patience taught her son to hide. To be slow when quick-s might attract attention. To be silent when speaking might reveal knowledge. To be invisible, unremarkable, forgettable. And Elijah learned these lessons well. So well that when the moment came to act, no one expected him to be capable of anything at all. The hidden notebooks that Patience kept were small, perhaps 4 inches by 6, bound in leather that she had salvaged from a damaged shipment and carefully sewn into covers. She made the paper herself from cotton rags, pressing and drying it in sheets that she cut to size. The ink was walnut hull extract, visible only when heated, allowing the pages to appear blank under casual inspection. Even the binding was designed for concealment. The spines could be opened to reveal a narrow cavity where the most incriminating pages could be hidden. She began this project in 1843, 2 years after Elijah witnessed his first auction. The catalyst was a visitor, a free black man from Cincinnati who came to Cairo on legitimate business. He was a barber who traveled the rivers, serving clients on steamboats and at port towns, but who also carried messages for the network. He met with Patience secretly, in the small garden behind the Hargrove building, where she was sometimes permitted to tend vegetables. He told her about the work being done in the North, about the movement that was growing, about the desperate need for information from inside the slave trading operations. Patience had information. She had years of observations, fragments of knowledge, pieces of a puzzle that she had never imagined anyone would want to assemble. But she had no way to organize it, no system to make it useful. The barber taught her the basics: how to structure records, how to create cross-references, how to develop the cipher that would protect the contents. And he gave her the first notebook, already prepared, waiting only for her to fill it with the truths she had been accumulating. Over the next 5 years, Patience filled 11 notebooks. She recorded every sale she could verify, every transaction she could document, every atrocity she witnessed or learned of from others. She noted the arrival and departure of slave shipments, the names of the captains who transported them, the routes they traveled. She documented the bribes that Hargrove paid to local officials, the frauds that were perpetrated on buyers and sellers alike, the murders that were disguised as accidents or escapes. And most importantly, she recorded what Elijah told her each night. The boy's memory was the key to everything. Patients could observe only what happened in her immediate vicinity. Elijah, with his peripheral duties, saw everything, and he remembered everything. His nightly recitations became the core of the record, the detailed testimony that transformed fragments into a comprehensive picture. The notebooks were smuggled out one at a time, carried by operatives who visited Cairo in various disguises, as merchants, as travelers, as servants accompanying white passengers on the steamboats. Each notebook made its way to Cincinnati, where Levi Coffin maintained the central archive of the network. There, the information was transcribed, decoded, organized, and shared with the people who could use it. Lawyers preparing freedom suits, journalists investigating the trade, politicians building the case for abolition. But the notebooks were only copies. The originals remained in Cairo, hidden in a location that only Patience and Elijah knew. This was deliberate. If the copies were intercepted, the originals would survive. If the originals were discovered, the copies would already be beyond Hargrove's reach. And if disaster struck, if Patience was discovered, if Elijah was sold, if everything fell apart, the information would still exist, still be available, still be dangerous to those who most deserved to fear it. The hiding place was a hollowed-out beam in the cellar where Patience and Elijah slept. The beam was structural, part of the building's foundation, apparently solid but actually containing a cavity large enough to hold a dozen notebooks and several other items. The key that Patience had obtained through means she never explained, a map of the building marked with guard positions and schedules, a set of forged freedom papers prepared for both of them, a small amount of money in coins that could not be traced. Elijah had known about this hiding place since he was 8. His mother had shown it to him, made him memorize the location, the mechanism for opening it, the contents, and their purposes. She had made him practice retrieving items in complete darkness, returning them without leaving any sign of disturbance. She had prepared him, he understood later, for exactly the situation that eventually occurred. The night of October 3rd, 1848, after his mother was killed, after he was locked in the cellar, Elijah went to the hiding place. The darkness was absolute. There were no windows, no light sources, nothing but the black that pressed against his eyes like physical weight. But he had practiced in darkness, had memorized every step, had trained his hands to find the beam and locate the pressure point and slide the panel aside. The contents were exactly as he expected. The originals of the notebooks, 11 small volumes containing years of documented crimes. The key, the map, the papers, the money. He took the key and the map. He left everything else. He would return for it if he could, but the most important information was already beyond Hargrove's reach, safe in Cincinnati, and the most valuable intelligence was in his head, where no one could find it. The key opened the cellar door. The map showed him the route through the building. And at 3:06 in the morning of October 4th, 1848, Elijah lit the lantern that would summon the liberation he had been trained since childhood to enable. The steamboat was called the Queen of the West, a side-wheeler of modest size but considerable speed that made regular runs between Cairo and Cincinnati. Her captain, Isaiah Beaumont, had been secretly aiding the network for 3 years, carrying fugitives disguised as deck cargo, providing information about river traffic and slave catcher movements, and occasionally, as on this night, providing his vessel as a transport for larger operations. Beaumont did not consider himself an abolitionist. He considered himself a Christian, a Methodist specifically, who had experienced a conversion at a camp meeting in 1845, and who had emerged from that experience unable to participate in the system of bondage without feeling that he was damning his own soul. He still transported enslaved people on occasion, when refusing would have exposed his sympathies and ended his usefulness. But whenever he could, he aided escape. He saw it as penance for the times he could not. On the night of October 3rd, the Queen of the West was docked at Cairo's public landing, ostensibly waiting for a cargo of flour that would be loaded the following morning. In reality, she was waiting for a signal. Beaumont had been told only that the signal would come from a third-floor window of the Hargrove building, that it would be a lantern light, and that when it appeared, he should be ready to depart immediately with whatever passengers arrived at his gangplank. He waited. The hours passed. The sounds of Hargrove's celebration drifted across the waterfront, music and laughter and the clink of glasses, the sounds of white men enjoying the profits of black suffering. Beaumont prayed, as he often did, that God would forgive him for the times he had not acted and grant him the courage to act when the moment came. The moment came at 3:06 in the morning. The light appeared in the window, flickered for perhaps 40 seconds, and went dark. Beaumont gave the order to fire the boilers. Meanwhile, in the town, the operatives were moving. Frederick, this was not his real name, nor would his real name appear in any written record of the liberation, a precaution that all operatives took, had positioned his teams hours earlier. They had entered Cairo separately, in ones and twos, over the course of the previous 3 days. Some posed as laborers seeking work on the docks. Others claimed to be traveling to New Orleans for business. One woman carried papers identifying her as a free seamstress looking for employment. None of them attracted attention. Cairo was a transient place, full of strangers, and the Hargroves' operation was not the only business conducted after dark. Frederick's plan was elegant in its simplicity. The building had 3 entrances: the front door, a side door used for deliveries, and a rear door that opened into the alley. 3 guards were on duty at night, 1 for each door, with a 4th stationed on the 2nd floor to watch the interior corridors. The holding cells on the 3rd floor were secured by a single heavy door, locked from the outside with no guard. The cells themselves were considered secure, and the stairway was the only access. The teams would neutralize the guards simultaneously, gaining access to all 3 entrances at once. One team would then proceed to the 3rd floor to open the cells, while the others secured the perimeter and prepared the escape route. The entire operation was planned to take less than 30 minutes from first contact to departure. The signal changed everything. The plan had assumed that Patience would give the signal, that she would be available to guide the interior team, that she would have prepared the captives for what was coming. Instead, the signal came from Elijah, a 12-year-old boy whom most of the operatives had never met. Frederick had to improvise. The neutralization of the guards went as planned. The front door guard was approached by 2 operatives posing as drunk sailors looking for a tavern. While he directed them away from the building, a 3rd operative came up behind him with a chloroform-soaked rag. The side door guard was surprised by a woman who knocked and claimed to be delivering a message from one of the party guests. When he opened the door, she stepped aside, and a man with a club ended the conversation. The rear door guard was the most difficult. He was positioned inside the alley, visible from multiple angles, and he had a pistol at his belt. But he also had a weakness, one that the network's intelligence had identified months earlier. He liked to drink. A bottle of doctored whiskey, left where he would find it, did most of the work. The operative who finally approached him found a man barely conscious, easily disarmed, easily bound. The interior guard presented a different challenge. He was on the 2nd floor, patrolling a corridor that connected the front and rear stairways. He was armed, alert, and impossible to approach without being seen. Frederick solved this problem with a distraction. One of the operatives entering through the front door deliberately made noise, drawing the guard's attention forward while a 2nd operative came up the rear stairs and neutralized him from behind. All 4 guards were incapacitated within 8 minutes of the signal. Not one of them was killed, though the one who had taken the drugged whiskey would feel the effects for days afterward. Frederick's insistence on avoiding fatalities when possible was not just moral, it was strategic. Dead guards created investigations, manhunts, reprisals. Unconscious guards created confusion, uncertainty, and delay. Elijah met the interior team at the door to the 3rd floor cells. He had the key, the one his mother had hidden. He had the knowledge of the building that the operatives lacked. And he had something else, a calm, a composure, a steadiness that astonished the adults who encountered him. He was 12 years old. His mother had been beaten to death in front of him 6 hours earlier. And he moved through the operation as if he had been planning it himself for years. Which, in a sense, he had. The cells held 63 people that night. They had been told nothing about what was coming. Patience's discovery and death had prevented any preparation. When the door opened and armed men entered with lanterns, many of them believed they were about to be killed. The panic could have been catastrophic. It was Elijah who prevented it. He stepped forward into the light where the captives could see him. Many of them recognized him. The quiet boy who carried water, who emptied the waste buckets, who sometimes brought extra food to the cells when the guards were not watching. He spoke to them in a voice that carried despite its softness, telling them what was happening, what they needed to do, how they would reach freedom if they followed instructions. He spoke in English, and then, for those who did not understand, in the Gullah-influenced dialect that many of the coastal slaves used. He spoke with an authority that belied his age and his size. They believed him. They followed. The departure was organized into 7 groups of 9. Each group was led by an operative who knew the route to the river. They moved at intervals, taking different paths through the town's unlit streets, using the fog that had risen from the water as cover. The first group left the building at 3:51 in the morning. The last group, with Elijah himself, departed at 4:38. The Queen of the West was waiting. Beaumont had the fires up, the steam pressure rising, the crew prepared for immediate departure. As each group arrived at the gangplank, they were directed below decks to a cargo hold that had been cleared and provisioned for passengers. Water, food, blankets, everything they would need for the journey upriver. Elijah was the last to board. He paused at the gangplank, looking back at the town that had been his prison, at the building that had been his home and his hell, at the place where his mother had lived and died. Frederick, standing beside him, put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's time," he said. Elijah nodded. He walked up the gangplank without looking back again. The crew pulled in the lines, and the Queen of the West moved out into the current, turning her bow northward toward Cincinnati and freedom. Behind them, Cairo slept on. The celebration in the Hargrove building had ended hours earlier, and the family slept in their beds, unaware that their empire was crumbling. The guards, bound and gagged, would not be discovered until dawn. The empty cells would not be noticed until the sun was well up, and the great auction that had been scheduled for that morning was supposed to begin. 63 people had been liberated. 12 of them were children. 4 were over 60. 9 were members of families that had expected to be separated that very day. All of them would reach freedom. Not one would be recaptured. And at the center of it all, sitting in the hold of the Queen of the West as she churned upriver, was a 12-year-old boy who carried in his mind the evidence that would help bring down an empire. The discovery of the liberation came at 6:47 in the morning of October 4th, 1848. A kitchen slave named Rebecca, arriving to prepare breakfast for the Hargrove household, found the front door guard tied and gagged in the entrance hall. Her screams woke the house. The next hours were chaos. Guards released, guns drawn, cells inspected, and found empty. The alley searched, the waterfront searched, every slave quarter in Cairo searched. Nothing. 63 people had vanished in the night, and not a single witness could be found who had seen them go. Thaddeus Hargrove, when he understood what had happened, did not rage. He went silent, pale, old in a way he had not seemed the night before. He sent for the sheriff. He sent telegraphs to slave catchers across 3 states. He posted the rewards. And then he retired to his office and closed the door, emerging hours later with new lines carved into his face and a tremor in his hands that would never quite disappear. Cornelius Hargrove did rage. He raged at the guards for their failure. He raged at the servants for their presumed complicity. He raged at his brothers for their absence, at his father for his silence, at the entire world for conspiring against him. And most of all, he raged at the thought of the boy, the invisible, unremarkable boy who had somehow impossibly slipped through his fingers and taken with him not just himself, but more than 60 souls who should have made the family rich. The investigation that followed was extensive and futile. Slave catchers combed the rivers for 300 miles in all directions. Informants were paid, suspects were questioned, rumors were pursued. The network of safe houses and conductors stretched like a web across the free states, and no matter how hard the catchers pulled at the strands, they could not find the spider at the center. One by one, the freed captives disappeared into that web. Some went to Canada, where the law could not reach them. Others settled in free black communities in Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. Still others traveled west to Kansas and beyond, where the question of slavery was still being contested and where a person with skills and determination might build a new life. The trails fragmented, the evidence scattered, and by the time the snow fell in December, the pursuit had effectively ended. But the consequences had only begun. Elijah's testimony, transcribed and distributed through abolitionist networks, reached the major anti-slavery newspapers within weeks. The National Era published excerpts in November. The Liberator ran a full account in December. Pamphlets were printed and distributed by the thousands. The name of Hargrove, which had been known only to those involved in the trade, became notorious across the North. The impact was not merely rhetorical. Lawyers used the testimony to mount challenges in cases where Hargrove's operation was implicated. Politicians cited it in congressional debates. Ministers preached sermons about it. The detailed, documented nature of the evidence, names, dates, prices, atrocities, made it impossible to dismiss as propaganda or exaggeration. Here was proof, irrefutable proof, of what many had chosen not to see. The response from the South was predictable. Hargrove was denounced as a victim of abolitionist slander. The testimony was called fabrication, the product of Northern agitators seeking to undermine the peculiar institution. Newspapers in Charleston and New Orleans published defenses of the slave trade as a civilizing force, a Christian mission, an economic necessity that the North could not understand. But the damage was done. Even slaveholders who publicly defended the system privately questioned the wisdom of doing business with Hargrove. Buyers who had once prized the Cairo operation for its efficiency now wondered what records might exist of their purchases, what witnesses might someday come forward, what their own names might appear in documents they could not control. The trade continued, but it shifted away from Cairo, seeking venues that had not been so thoroughly exposed. By 1852, Hargrove and Associates was effectively defunct. The building still stood, but the cells were empty. The alley was silent. The elaborate machinery of human commerce that Thaddeus Hargrove had built over 20 years had been destroyed in a single night by a 12-year-old boy with an extraordinary memory, and a mother who had taught him how to use it. Elijah spent the years after the liberation in constant motion. For the first 2 years, the danger of recapture was too great for him to settle anywhere. He moved between safe houses, never staying more than a few weeks, always alert for slave catchers who might recognize him. The $10,000 bounty on his head made him one of the most wanted fugitives in the country. But even in hiding, he continued his work. At each stop, he recited what he knew to abolitionists who transcribed his words. He answered questions, clarified details, provided the specific information that investigators needed to pursue particular cases. His memory had become an archive, a library of suffering that could be consulted whenever the movement needed evidence. By 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act had made the danger even greater. The new law required Northerners to assist in the capture of escaped slaves, imposed heavy penalties on those who helped fugitives, and denied accused runaways the right to a jury trial. What had been risky before was now potentially catastrophic. Slave catchers operated openly in the North, and federal commissioners earned fees for returning fugitives to bondage. Elijah responded by going further north, eventually crossing into Canada in 1851. He settled briefly in St. Catharines, Ontario, where a community of escaped slaves had formed under the leadership of Harriet Tubman. There, for the first time since his mother's death, he felt something approaching safety. But safety was not satisfaction. Elijah could not forget what he knew. He could not abandon the people who remained in bondage, the people whose names and faces he carried in his memory, the people who had been sold through Cairo and scattered across the South. He had survived. He had escaped. He had an obligation, he felt, to use his survival for something more than personal freedom. In 1853, he returned to the United States. He enrolled in Oberlin College, one of the few institutions that admitted black students, where he studied history and rhetoric. He was 18 years old, but his education had been interrupted by childhood in the holding cells of a slave trader. He had much to learn. He was also invited to speak. His testimony had made him famous in abolitionist circles, and now that he was old enough to appear in public, Organizations across the North wanted to hear from him directly. He gave his first speech in March of 1854 to a meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society in Boston. His voice, still young, carried across the hall with a clarity that silenced the audience. He did not rant or weep or plead. He simply remembered, in meticulous detail, what he had seen. And that was enough. The speaking engagements multiplied. Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Chicago. He appeared at churches and meeting halls, at women's auxiliary gatherings and radical convocations. He met Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and William Lloyd Garrison. He testified before state legislatures considering personal liberty laws. And always, he remembered, always, he provided the specific, documented truth that the movement needed to counteract the propaganda of the slaveholders. His first book, The Cairo Record, A Witness to the American Slave Trade, was published in 1856. It compiled his testimony into a comprehensive account of the Hargrove operation, supplemented by documents from his mother's hidden notebooks that had been retrieved from Cairo after the liberation. The book sold modestly but influenced significantly. It was cited in congressional debates, quoted in sermons, used as evidence in legal proceedings. The Civil War, when it came, found Elijah prepared. He enlisted in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first black units in the Union Army. He served not as a combatant, his slight build made him unsuitable for frontline service, but as a clerk and intelligence officer. His talent for memory and organization made him valuable in ways that required no physical strength. He tracked Confederate movements, analyzed captured documents, and helped identify prisoners who might be willing to provide information. After the war, during Reconstruction, he returned to the South. Not to Cairo, that town had been largely destroyed by flooding and never recovered, but to the regions where the people he had helped liberate had been born. He worked with the Freedmen's Bureau, helping to reunite families separated by slavery, using his memory to connect people who had lost each other decades earlier. He recognized names, recalled faces, made connections that no one else could have made. He published his second book in 1878, The Ledger of Souls, Memory as Liberation. This was more than testimony. It was a memoir, a philosophy, a meditation on what it meant to carry the weight of remembered atrocity and to use that weight for redemption. The book was less successful commercially than his first, but it achieved a lasting influence among scholars and activists who discovered it in the decades that followed. His final years were spent in Oberlin, in the town where he had found his education and his voice. He taught at the college, an informal instructor in history and memory techniques. He spoke occasionally at commemorations and anniversaries. He lived simply, in a small house filled with books and papers, surrounded by the documentation of a lifetime of witness. In the spring of 1903, he made his last journey to Cairo. The town was transformed beyond recognition. The floods of 1858 had washed away much of the original settlement, and successive disasters had reduced what remained to a shadow. The Hargrove building was long gone, replaced by commercial structures that knew nothing of what had stood before. The alley had been paved over, its flagstones buried under layers of gravel and concrete. Elijah walked through the space where he had witnessed so much horror. He stood where his mother had died. He closed his eyes and remembered, not just the suffering, but the liberation. Not just the death, but the escape. Not just the horror, but the transformation of that horror into evidence, testimony, truth. He died on September 14, 1903. He was 69 years old. His obituary in the Oberlin Review described him as a scholar and humanitarian whose memory preserved what others wished to forget. His tombstone, still standing in Oberlin Cemetery, bears a simple inscription, Elijah, son of Patience. He remembered. The records that Patience compiled did not disappear with her death or the liberation of October 1848. The hidden notebooks retrieved from Cairo made their way to various archives over the following decades. Today, fragments of her work can be found in the Library of Congress, Howard University, Oberlin College, and the Cincinnati Museum Center. Scholars continue to study them, finding in her careful documentation evidence that illuminates not just the specific crimes of Hargrove and Associates, but the broader structure of the American slave trade. Her cipher was decoded in 1892 by a linguist at Howard University who had dedicated years to the project. Once readable, the notebooks revealed connections that Elijah's testimony alone could not establish. Networks of corruption extending into government offices, patterns of fraud affecting hundreds of cases, evidence of kidnapping and murder that had never been investigated. Some of this evidence was used in historical research. Some of it, shamefully, was used by the descendants of the guilty to identify and destroy other records that might have exposed their ancestors. Elijah's own testimony, preserved in transcriptions and publications, has remained influential. Historians of slavery cite his accounts regularly. Legal scholars have used his descriptions of the Cairo operation to understand the mechanics of the internal slave trade. His memory techniques, documented in his second book, have been studied by psychologists and educators interested in the possibilities of human recall. But perhaps the most important legacy is the one that cannot be documented: the lives that were lived because of the liberation of October 1848. 63 people escaped that night. They had children. Who had children? Who had children in turn? The genealogies are incomplete, but researchers estimate that several thousand people alive today are descended from those who walked off the Queen of the West in Cincinnati on the morning of October 5, 1848. They include teachers and doctors, lawyers and artists, soldiers and scientists. They include people who know their history and people who have never heard of Cairo or Hargrove or the boy named Elijah. They include people who carry the memories of their ancestors and people who have forgotten. But they all exist, living and breathing and dreaming, because a 12-year-old boy lit a lantern in a window on an October night, and a network of brave souls answered the signal. The ground remembers. The river remembers. And now, having heard this story, you remember too.